It was mid-July, the height of summer in Vermont, when the air was warm and thick, and the days stretched long into the evenings. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden light over the yard. My 7-year-old son, Louis, was running barefoot through the grass, a makeshift cape tied around his neck as he pretended to be a superhero. His laughter echoed against the trees, a sound that always lifted my spirits. Hannah, my wife of 8 years, was sitting on the back porch, her hands dusted with soil from repotting a line of geraniums. She had a talent for bringing life to any corner of our home, whether it was through her garden or her art, and the backyard was no exception. I had just come in from the workshop, wiping sweat from my brow after hours of sanding down a set of cabinets for a client. Woodworking had been my trade for years, and while it wasn't always easy, there was something deeply satisfying about crafting something tangible with my hands. The scent of dinner drifted from the kitchen. Hannah had a roast chicken in the oven, paired with vegetables we'd pulled from the garden earlier that week. It was one of those summer days where everything felt steady and ordinary, in the best way possible. That's when Melanie's car pulled into the driveway. Melanie was Hannah's younger sister, a constant presence in our lives. She had always been full of energy, the kind of person who lit up a room with her enthusiasm. She stepped out of the car with a radiant smile, waving at Louis as he ran up to greet her. "Look, Aunt Mel's here," Louis shouted, practically tackling her with a hug. Melanie walked up to the porch, her eyes glinting with excitement. Even before she spoke, I could tell she had news. She hugged Hannah tightly, then turned to me with a grin that practically stretched across her face. We invited her inside, and she didn't waste any time before announcing her big news. James, her boyfriend of 3 years, had proposed the night before. Hannah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in delight, while Melanie pulled out her phone to show us a picture of the ring. It was a beautiful piece, understated but elegant, exactly the kind of style Melanie would choose. As Melanie shared the details of the proposal, Louis climbed into Hannah's lap, his eyes wide with curiosity. Melanie described how James had taken her to the lake where they'd had their first date, setting up a picnic under the stars. She couldn't stop smiling as she talked, her happiness filling the room. Hannah, always the planner, immediately started asking about the wedding, where it would be, what kind of decorations she wanted, who would be involved. Melanie admitted she hadn't thought that far ahead, but she did know one thing. She wanted the wedding to be held at their parents' house. "It's perfect," Hannah said, her mind already spinning with ideas. "The backyard is beautiful this time of year, and there's so much space for everyone." By the time Melanie left that evening, the sun had set, and the fireflies were out, blinking softly in the darkness. Louis tugged at my hand, asking if he could stay up a little longer to catch fireflies, and I couldn't say no. As we stood in the yard, Hannah joined us, her face still glowing from the excitement of Melanie's news. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, watching as Louis darted through the grass with a jar in hand. It was one of those moments that felt timeless, the kind you'd want to hold on to forever. The week after Melanie's announcement, the buzz of wedding planning took over our lives. Hannah was thrilled to throw herself into it, spending hours on the phone with Melanie and their mother, Carol, brainstorming ideas. By the time Saturday rolled around, Melanie had invited us to her parents' house to start putting together a plan. The drive there was as familiar as it was scenic. Vermont's countryside in the summer felt alive, the fields green and endless, dotted with farmhouses and wildflowers. Louis sat in the back seat, chattering excitedly about seeing his cousins. He loved visiting his grandparents' house. It was a sprawling property with plenty of space for kids to run wild, complete with an old tire swing and a big oak tree that had been the backdrop for countless family photos. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was already bustling with activity. Carol and Richard, my in-laws, were on the porch greeting relatives as they arrived. Carol was waving us in before we even had the car doors shut, her voice warm and inviting as always. Inside, the chaos was in full swing. The dining table was covered with scraps of fabric, rolls of ribbon, and an assortment of wedding magazines. Carol and Melanie were bent over a notebook, jotting down ideas while Hannah joined them, adding her input with the same enthusiasm she brought to her art projects. Louis disappeared almost immediately, running off to play with his cousins in the backyard. I followed Richard outside, where he and a couple of Melanie's cousins were measuring the yard for the reception setup. They were trying to figure out how to string up lights and where to place the tables for maximum space. I spent the next hour helping with their plans, holding up lengths of wire and hammering stakes into the ground. It felt good to be useful, even if the task itself was tedious. The work kept me occupied, and for a while, I let myself get swept up in the excitement of it all. When I went back inside for a drink, I found the house just as lively as before. Melanie's fiancé, James, had arrived and was deep in conversation with one of the uncles about music choices for the reception. The cousins' wives were in the living room, blowing up balloons and laughing over stories from past family gatherings. Hannah and Melanie were now at the couch, joined by Allan. He was cutting strips of fabric for the garlands, his usual easygoing smile on full display. Allan had been a part of Hannah and Melanie's lives since they were kids, practically another sibling. He was the kind of person who made himself indispensable in any situation, always lending a hand or cracking a joke to lighten the mood. I lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching the scene unfold. It was one of those moments that made me grateful to be part of such a large, connected family, even if it could feel overwhelming at times. As I stood there, Louis ran into the room, his face red from playing outside. Without hesitation, he climbed onto the couch, plopping himself between Hannah and Allan with a grin. Everyone laughed at his dramatic entrance, and someone, maybe one of the cousins, jokingly said, "Louis really takes after Allan, doesn't he?" The room erupted into laughter, but I didn't join in. My eyes darted between Louis and Allan, and for the first time, I noticed something that had never occurred to me before. There was a resemblance. It wasn't obvious at first, but now that the idea had been planted, I couldn't unsee it. The shape of their faces, the way their hair curled at the ends, it was subtle, but it was there. I brushed it off in the moment, telling myself it was just a silly joke, but the thought lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. Even after we left that evening, the laughter of the gathering still ringing in my ears, my mind kept circling back to that comment. The drive home was quiet. Hannah and Louis were both in high spirits, recounting the day and talking about the wedding plans, but I could barely focus. I caught myself glancing at Louis in the rearview mirror more than once, studying his features in a way I hadn't before. By the time we got home and settled in for the night, the house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that gives your thoughts too much room to grow. As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the comment from earlier replayed in my head, over and over again. It was probably nothing. A joke, a coincidence. That's what I told myself, but the unease in my chest told a different story. The following days were consumed by wedding preparations. The excitement from Melanie's engagement seemed to spread through the entire family, and Hannah threw herself into the planning with her usual enthusiasm. Our dining table turned into a workshop, covered in ribbons, fabric, and half-finished decorations. Louis loved helping too, though his idea of helping often meant running off with a roll of tape or scattering glitter in places we'd be finding for weeks. Hannah's parents' house became the hub for it all. Every couple of days, we'd make the drive back there, bringing supplies or lending a hand with whatever needed to be done. Each visit felt more chaotic than the last. Cousins hauling in tables, uncles setting up sound equipment, aunts unpacking boxes of decorations. It was the kind of busy energy that should have felt infectious, but for me, it only added to the unease I couldn't shake. The comment about Louis and Allan hadn't left my mind. Every time I looked at Louis, I found myself noticing things I hadn't before. His hair, his smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. It all seemed to line up in ways that made my stomach twist. It didn't help that Allan was always around. He was practically a permanent fixture at Hannah's parents' house, helping with everything from setting up lights to crafting decorations. I couldn't fault him for it. He was genuinely helpful, the kind of person who seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. But every time I saw him with Hannah or Louis, a small part of me felt like an outsider in my own family. I watched the way they laughed together, the ease with which they shared inside jokes from years of friendship, and it only deepened the knot in my chest. Hannah, for her part, seemed oblivious to my growing discomfort. She was too focused on the wedding to notice my distracted mood, too wrapped up in her sister's happiness to catch the moments when my smile didn't quite reach my eyes. One evening, after a particularly long day of preparations, we stayed for dinner at Hannah's parents' house. The table was crowded with relatives, the air filled with the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. Louis was sitting between Hannah and Allan, chattering excitedly about some game he'd played with his cousins earlier. I couldn't help but watch them. The way Louis leaned into Allan's side, the way Allan tousled his hair. It felt too familiar, too natural. At one point, Carol leaned over and said something about how great Allan was with kids. She laughed and added that he'd always been good with Louis, almost like he was part of the family. The comment was innocent enough, but it felt like a slap in the face. I excused myself to the kitchen, pretending I needed to refill my drink, and stood there for longer than I should have, staring out the window into the darkened yard. That night, the drive home was quieter than usual. Hannah and Louis were both tired, their earlier energy replaced by the contented calm that comes after a long, busy day. As I lay in bed later, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing, my thoughts refused to quiet. I found myself replaying the events of the evening, dissecting every look, every laugh, every word. It wasn't just a joke anymore. The resemblance between Louis and Allan was undeniable, and the way they interacted, the familiarity, the connection, was something I couldn't ignore. I turned over, my chest tightening with a mix of anger, confusion, and fear. Whatever this was, I couldn't keep brushing it aside, but I didn't know what to do next. Wedding preparations continued to dominate our days, each one busier than the last. The yard at Hannah's parents' house had been transformed into a picturesque setting, with strings of lights woven through the trees and long tables set under a makeshift canopy. Melanie and James had picked every detail carefully, and Hannah threw herself into the work with an energy I hadn't seen in a while. Louis was just as enthusiastic, darting between the cousins and his grandparents, lending his small hands to whatever task caught his attention. One afternoon, he was in the middle of the lawn with Carol, carefully folding napkins as she showed him how to make swan shapes. His brow furrowed with concentration, and when he finally got it right, his face lit up with the kind of smile that could brighten even the heaviest of hearts. I should have been content watching them, feeling the warmth of family in those moments. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. Every time I looked at Louis, I found myself noticing the features that didn't seem to fit. His green eyes, the curl of his hair, the way his laugh sounded. Every detail sent my mind spiraling back to Allan. Allan, of course, was always there. Whether he was carrying decorations or helping Richard with the sound system, he seemed to be part of everything. It wasn't unusual. He'd been a family fixture for years, but lately, every time I saw him, I felt a tightening in my gut. It was the way he fit into the family, almost too easily. The way he looked at Hannah when they talked, the way Louis gravitated toward him as if he were someone more than a family friend. Those small interactions started to feel heavier, their significance growing in my mind the more I thought about them. One evening, as we were packing up to leave, I caught a glimpse of them in the yard. Allan was lifting Louis onto his shoulders, the two of them laughing together as they stumbled around, pretending to be a monster. Hannah stood nearby, smiling at the scene with her arms loosely crossed. Anyone else would have seen nothing unusual, just a sweet moment between people who cared about each other. But to me, it felt like something else entirely. The drive home that night was quiet, the kind of silence that left too much room for my thoughts. I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Louis as he dozed off, and felt the knot in my stomach tighten. The similarities between him and Allan were undeniable. By the time we got home and I settled into bed, the thoughts were louder than ever. The possibility had crept in, uninvited, and now it refused to leave. Every rational argument I made against it only seemed to deepen my doubt. That night, as I stared at the ceiling, the idea of a DNA test came to me. It was a small, almost fleeting thought at first, but the more I turned it over in my mind, the more it began to feel like the only way to find peace. I needed to know the truth, even if I wasn't ready to admit it out loud. Hannah was already asleep beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful. I looked over at her, wondering how she'd react if she knew what I was thinking. Would she be hurt? Angry? Or would she understand why the thought had taken root? I told myself I wouldn't act on it. Not yet. There were still preparations to finish, and the wedding was only days away. But the idea of the test was there now, a silent presence that wouldn't be ignored. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I was standing on uncertain ground, and I didn't know what I'd find when the dust finally settled. The days leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity, leaving little time for anything but work and preparation. The house seemed to overflow with boxes of decorations, stacks of folded linens, and unfinished crafts that Hannah insisted would tie everything together perfectly. Each morning, we loaded the car and drove to her parents' house, joining the growing number of relatives who were determined to make the event as seamless as possible. Despite the busyness, my thoughts were never far from the idea of the DNA test. It had settled in my mind like a thorn, nagging and persistent, growing sharper with every interaction between Lewis and Allan. I watched them constantly now, my eyes drawn to their similarities in ways I couldn't stop. At one point, while we were setting up the tables for the reception, Lewis ran over to Allan, who was fixing a string of lights near the edge of the yard. He tugged at Allan's sleeve, asking to help, and Allan smiled as he lifted Lewis onto a stool, showing him how to screw in the small bulbs. It was a simple, innocent moment, but it struck me harder than it should have. They looked like they belonged together, their matching grins twisting something deep inside me. Hannah, of course, noticed nothing. She was in her element, moving between tasks with a focused energy that left no room for distractions. She laughed easily with Melanie, worked tirelessly to organize everything, and still found time to sit with Carol and chat about plans for the day after the wedding. She seemed so at peace, so sure of the life we'd built, and it made the weight I was carrying feel even heavier. That evening, after another long day at her parents' house, we came home to a quiet house. Lewis was exhausted, falling asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. Hannah and I sat together on the couch for a while, her head resting on my shoulder as she scrolled through photos of the preparations. She talked about how perfect everything was coming together, how proud she was of Melanie, how excited she was for the wedding. I nodded along, trying to match her enthusiasm, but my mind was elsewhere. As she talked, I thought about the kit I had ordered earlier that afternoon. I had hesitated for days, second-guessing myself, but the moment had come, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The kit arrived 2 days later, discreetly packaged in a plain box. I picked it up from the mailbox while Hannah and Lewis were out running errands. My hands trembled as I carried it inside, hiding it in the back of my workshop, where I knew it wouldn't be found. That night, after Hannah and Lewis had gone to bed, I took the kit out and opened it, reading the instructions carefully. It was simple enough: a quick swab, a few labels, and a prepaid envelope to send it off. My heart pounded as I stood outside Lewis's room, staring at the closed door. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was unnecessary, but the thought wasn't enough to stop me. I stepped inside, careful not to wake him, and gently took the sample I needed before retreating back to my workshop. The entire process took less than 10 minutes, but it left me feeling drained. I stared at the sealed envelope in my hands, knowing that once I sent it off, there would be no turning back. Whatever the result, my life would change. The next morning, I dropped the envelope into the mailbox, my stomach churning as I watched it disappear. I told myself that I needed this, that the doubt was eating me alive, but the guilt lingered all the same. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on the wedding preparations, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of what I had done. Every time I saw Lewis, I felt a pang of regret, wondering if I had betrayed him by questioning his place in my life. Every time I looked at Hannah, I wondered what she would think if she knew. I carried the secret alone, waiting for the results, knowing that whatever they revealed, there was no going back to the way things were. The wedding was only a day away, but for me, it felt like the calm before a storm I couldn't control. The wedding day arrived with all the chaos and beauty that had been building for weeks. The weather couldn't have been better, warm, sunny, and clear, with a light breeze rustling the trees around the yard. Hannah had been up before dawn, buzzing with excitement as she packed up the last decorations and helped Lewis get ready. She looked radiant in her floral dress, her energy spilling over into everything she touched. I tried to match her mood, but the knot in my stomach made it impossible. I hadn't told her about the DNA test. I hadn't told anyone. The truth hung over me like a storm cloud, a secret I carried alone as the hours ticked by. We arrived at her parents' house early, the yard already a hive of activity. Melanie looked stunning in her wedding dress, her smile lighting up the scene as she moved between friends and family. Everyone was busy with last-minute tasks, adjusting chairs, fluffing tablecloths, checking the sound system. And I threw myself into the work, hoping it would distract me from the thoughts swirling in my head. But no matter how much I tried to focus, I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for the notification I knew was coming. I had given the lab my email, and the results were due to arrive that day. Each time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, only to sink when it was just another message from a guest running late or a reminder about the timeline for the ceremony. I watched Louis dart around the yard, his bow tie slightly crooked, his face glowing with excitement as he played with his cousins. He was so happy, so full of life, and the sight of him should have brought me peace. But instead, it filled me with doubt. The same thoughts that had plagued me for weeks came rushing back, louder and sharper than ever. Allan, of course, was there too. He had been one of the first to arrive, helping Richard with the sound equipment and chatting with the uncles about logistics for the evening. He had that same effortless charm, the kind that made people gravitate toward him without even realizing it. I tried to avoid him, keeping my distance whenever I could, but it was impossible not to notice the way he moved through the day. At one point, I saw him kneeling by the dessert table, showing Louis how to balance a cookie on top of a stack of cupcakes without it falling. They laughed together, their matching grins hitting me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a passing resemblance anymore. It was something deeper, something undeniable. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Hannah sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my knee as we watched Melanie and James exchange vows under the arch I had built weeks earlier. The words of love and commitment should have moved me, but all I felt was the weight of my secret, the question that had taken over my mind. What would I do when the results came in? When the ceremony ended and everyone moved toward the reception, my phone buzzed again. This time, I knew it wasn't a message about the wedding. My heart stopped as I pulled it from my pocket, seeing the subject line I had been dreading. Your results are ready. I couldn't open it. Not yet. The crowd of laughing, smiling people around me made it impossible. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, telling myself I'd look at it later when I could be alone. But the weight of it stayed with me, pressing down with every step I took. I drank more than I should have during the reception, trying to numb the tension in my chest. Hannah noticed, of course, her brows furrowing as she asked if I was okay. I brushed her off, telling her I was just tired, but I could see the concern in her eyes. She wanted to ask more, but the chaos of the celebration pulled her away before she could. As the evening wore on, I kept catching myself staring at Allan. Every interaction he had with Louis, every laugh they shared, every smile he gave Hannah, it all felt heavier now, loaded with a meaning I didn't want to admit. My head was spinning, my thoughts tangled in a way that made it hard to breathe. By the time the speeches began, I was sitting at the edge of the tent, nursing another drink and trying to decide what to do. The email sat unopened on my phone, the truth waiting for me in black and white. I couldn't open it there, not in front of everyone, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The reception was in full swing by the time I finally slipped away. The music was loud, the dance floor packed with relatives swaying under strings of lights, and the laughter of children echoed from the yard. Hannah was deep in conversation with Melanie and a group of cousins, her face glowing with joy as she soaked in the happiness of the day. She didn't notice as I left the tent and headed toward the quiet edge of the property, where the noise faded into the evening air. The email sat unopened on my phone, a weight in my pocket that I could no longer ignore. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and tapped the screen, the subject line staring back at me like a dare. For a moment, I hesitated. I told myself that maybe I didn't need to know, that I could let the doubt fade over time and pretend it didn't exist. But the thought of living with that uncertainty, of carrying it with me every day, was unbearable. I opened the email. The words were clinical and straightforward, devoid of any emotion, but they hit me like a physical blow. The results were conclusive. Louis wasn't my son. The world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath me unsteady as I reread the lines, hoping I had misunderstood. But the words didn't change. The truth was staring back at me, undeniable and cruel. I felt a rush of emotions, anger, betrayal, devastation, but most of all, an overwhelming sense of loss. Louis wasn't just a boy I had raised. He was my world, my reason for everything. And now, in the space of a few lines of text, that foundation had been shattered. For a long time, I stood there, staring out at the darkening sky as the reality of it all sank in. The sounds of the reception were distant now, muffled by the pounding in my chest. I couldn't face anyone, least of all Hannah. When I finally made my way back to the tent, I went straight to the bar. I needed something to dull the edges of the pain, to keep myself from breaking apart in front of everyone. The bartender poured me a drink, and then another, and before long, the alcohol blurred the sharpness of my thoughts, though it did little to ease the ache in my chest. Hannah found me eventually, her face lined with concern as she approached. She placed a hand on my arm, her voice soft as she asked what was wrong. I shrugged her off, unable to look at her, and muttered something about being tired. I saw the hurt flash across her face, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The hours passed in a haze, the laughter and music around me feeling like a cruel reminder of the life I thought I had. I avoided Hannah as much as I could, sticking to the edges of the celebration and nursing drink after drink. My mind raced with questions I didn't have answers to. How could she have done this? Did she think I'd never find out? When she cornered me again, I knew I couldn't avoid her anymore. She pulled me aside, her voice firm but trembling as she asked me to tell her what was going on. Her eyes searched mine, desperate for an answer, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. I told her about the DNA test, my words sharp and slurred from the alcohol. I told her what it revealed, how it proved that Louis wasn't mine, how it confirmed every suspicion I had tried to bury. Her face went pale, her hands trembling as she listened. At first, she denied it, her voice cracking as she insisted there must be a mistake. But when I pressed her, my anger spilling over into my words, she broke down. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted what she had done. She said it was a mistake, something that happened long ago, something she regretted more than anything. She begged me to understand, to forgive her, to think of the life we had built together. But I couldn't. Her words felt hollow, her tears meaningless. All I could see was the betrayal, the way she had shattered the trust one thought we had. I told her I didn't care about her excuses, that nothing she said could change what I knew now. I walked away before she could say anything else, leaving her standing there with tears in her eyes. The reception continued around us, the joy of the evening oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I poured myself another drink, the bitterness in my chest growing with every passing moment. As the night wore on, the weight of the truth pressed harder on me, a storm building in my chest that I couldn't contain. I sat at the edge of the reception, nursing yet another drink, my mind racing with everything I'd uncovered. The laughter and joy around me felt like a cruel mockery of the betrayal I now carried. I knew I couldn't stay silent, but the thought of ruining the night for everyone left me paralyzed. When it was time for the speeches, Melanie stood first, her words filled with love and gratitude for her family and James. Her voice quavered with emotion, and everyone clapped and cheered when she finished. Next came James, who spoke about the journey they had been on together and how excited he was for their future. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, glass in hand, and felt every pair of eyes in the room settle on me. My heart pounded as I took a deep breath, forcing myself to steady the shaking in my hands. I started with a sincere toast, my voice calm but hollow as I congratulated Melanie and James on their union. I spoke about love and trust, about the strength it takes to build a lasting partnership, and how proud I was to be part of this family. The room erupted into applause, and for a moment, I considered leaving it at that. But the truth was like fire in my veins, and I couldn't hold it back any longer. I cleared my throat, the noise cutting through the celebratory hum. The room quieted as I lowered my glass and looked directly at Hannah. My voice faltered as I said, "But tonight, I learned something that has shattered my own marriage." The silence was immediate, heavy, and suffocating. I saw the confusion spread across the room, whispers bubbling up as people turned to each other. I could see Hannah shaking her head slightly, her eyes begging me to stop. I didn't. I told them about the DNA test, how I had suspected for weeks that something wasn't right, how the results confirmed that Louis wasn't my son. My voice cracked as I spoke, the anger and hurt spilling out in ways I couldn't control. I heard someone gasp, "Maybe Carol," and Richard muttered something under his breath, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury. Melanie looked as though she didn't know whether to speak or stay silent, and James put a protective arm around her as if shielding her from the fallout. Allan shifted uncomfortably. His face was flushed, and for once, he seemed at a loss for words. The way he avoided looking at me only confirmed what I already knew. Behind me, I could hear murmurs as the guests started to talk. Whispers grew louder, confusion turning to speculation, and then to gasps as people pieced together what had happened. I didn't stay to hear the full aftermath. I set my glass down, my hands trembling as I ended the toast with a final, bitter truth. I wish Melanie and James a lifetime of happiness. I truly do. But as for me, I'll be filing for divorce. I can't forgive what's been done to me. The words hung in the air like a bomb, the silence deafening. Hannah broke down completely, her sobs loud and raw as she covered her face with her hands. Carol rushed to her side, wrapping her in a hug, while Richard stood stone-faced, his eyes darting between me and Allan. I couldn't take it anymore. I wandered to the edge of the property, where the trees cast long shadows under the moonlight. The silence out there was deafening, and for the first time that night, I felt the full weight of what I had lost. My marriage, my family, the life I had built, it was all crumbling, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Hannah. Her voice was shaky as she called my name, pleading with me to stop, to talk, to listen. I turned to face her, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, grief, and exhaustion. She was crying, her mascara smudged, her hands trembling as she reached out to me. She begged me to come back, to fix things, to think of Louis, to think of the baby we had been planning to have. Her words stung, each one a reminder of what had been destroyed. I told her I couldn't go back, that the trust we had was gone, and that no amount of apologies could change the truth. She broke down completely then, collapsing to her knees as sobs racked her body. I looked at her one last time, her tear-streaked face etched with desperation and regret. Her sobs filled the air, but I felt nothing but a hollow emptiness. "This is the end," I said quietly. "I can't do this anymore." Without another word, I turned and walked away, the weight of betrayal and heartbreak crushing but final. I left the house, the family, and the life I had built, disappearing from their world completely.